Robert is a professional luthier, but has a rather consuming passion for philosophy, which is, I think, anchored in philosophy of geometry. It also goes back into Sanskrit studies, which he did in at the New School. As a luthier, he's really quite becoming increasingly prominent, I would say, and is now, would I call you a director at the Hill Company in London? And he has made beautiful instruments for many very distinguished cellists and violinists. We started last year something called the Cello Project, and he will be speaking to a new chapter in the Cello Project. Let me just say very quickly how this developed. When we got together, I was teaching a course on Heidegger, and Robert challenged me to do a course on craft in a subsequent session. And that went pretty well. So we decided to do it again. And this, have I got this chronology right? Last August, Robert said, let's up the ante. We'll do another seminar on craft. Only this time I'll build a cello. And what you see here in front of you, and those who are on the stream will see shortly, is the cello that was built in August. We had an extraordinary seminar going on at the same time. I have to say this seminar prompted in me an alteration in my reading of Heidegger with regard to the question of craft. There were very interesting developments with regard to the question of labor and alienation. Robert was talking about philosophy of geometry, and it was an event. I have to say it was an event in an intellectual sense. We produced this. If you want to look, we produced this little brochure, which recounts a little bit the project. But this is a very tiny version of what is a book underway, and a very important part of this second chapter of the Cello Project is the question of its varnishing and it's the color brought to it, and that is where we arrive tonight. Robert is going to speak a bit about what he's doing now. He's already the studio is underway. You'll have smelled it coming in. And he will talk about what is afoot now, I think. Robert, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. And I wanted to start off by thinking about the role of teaching and dialogue and the dynamic at EGS, which I think is unique. And there was something in the Cello Project that I wanted to explore. And I wanted to teach a seminar on craft and on the philosophy of geometry, and also do something with my hands, which is what I do, it's my day job, and do that in a context where there was a larger project of thinking. I think this fit very well within the concept of teaching-led research, as described by Chris Finsk in a short thing that I will just quote quickly. It says, teaching in Saas-Fee is not just research-led, where the research has been undertaken by a professor whose voice is defining for the area of study involved. It is itself a form of research in which the students join the thinking process. The EGS thus pursues a form of teaching-led research where fundamental concepts are rethought and redeployed in dialogue that involves people from a broad range of professional and intellectual backgrounds. My question for myself coming into a seminar was, what can I bring to it? We'll be working with architects, with painters, with filmmakers, psychoanalysts, and philosophers. And I thought it would be fantastic to do something that required a different form of thought and also required the use of our hands, picking up a tool, working together, thinking, talking, and exploring a few texts. And it was a really fruitful experience for me because it was a continuation of a research project that is continuing now in terms of the varnish. We made the instrument last summer. The focus was on the philosophy of geometry in my part, some work on logic as well. But this year it's really about color because we have the instrument, it sings, it's alive, it needs to be decorated, painted, and finished, and protected by the varnish that we'll put onto it. And there's a research project that I've been involved with for the last 25 years, which is exploring Stradivarius Varnish. It's the obsession of every violin maker, And in fact, it's the longest running, ongoing, non-stop inspection and research project related to fine art materials and using the most advanced tools in chemistry in human history. Stradivari died in 1734, and people have been talking about and researching his varnish non-stop ever since. The conversation continues. And I wanted to bring that conversation here. I think one thing that's been really missing in that research project is a consideration of color and the way that color was used at the time. What color meant, what the materials meant for the people who were using them, how it affected their way of thinking, and how that process of forming materials, using materials, was actually considered in an alchemical mode as a form of self-sculpture and self-transformation. I think this has been fundamentally missing. There's been constantly an emphasis on the scientific aspect of varnish. You know, there's a new article every 6 months in Scientific American or some other journal talking about Stradivarius Varnish, and they finally found the secret. There's an underlying conversation that doesn't take place that I kind of wanted to open up here as we move some color around and put varnish on a cello. I decided to paint the cello and decorate it in the tradition of the day when Stradivari was alive, and also his teacher, Niccolò Amati. They would quite often, for a special instrument, decorate it in a particular way. One of the questions I wanted to explore in the seminar was, how does craft relate to reading? Reading can be considered a craft. It can be considered incredibly hard work, something that takes a skill that needs to be honed and refined. And I think that some of the best pedagogues I've been near and gotten to listen to, I would consider extraordinary craftspeople. And their way of crafting language, their way of reading, I think has a crossover with handwork and the approach to mastery that's deeply interesting to me. So I wanted to look at this as well. I decided to paint a cello, and I actually didn't do it. It was done by a friend of my daughter Agnes's, who is a designer. And I painted it with the words of St. Augustine from Book 8, where he writes tole on one side of this, and on the other side is lege. And it's a phrase from Augustine, and it means take and read. And I'll read the passage from Augustine where that appears, because I think it will inform this conversation. So this is the moment of Augustine's conversion, actually. And he's in a state of unbelievable anguish. And he's with a friend of his, and he's in a garden, and he says, I threw myself unknowingly under the fig tree on the ground, and I let my tears run free. How torrents broke from my eyes. And out of misery I yelled out, how much longer? For how much longer? Tomorrow and again, tomorrow. Why not now? Why will not this hour put an end to my grief? So I spoke and I cried in the greatest bitterness of my heart. And behold, from the neighboring house, I heard the voice of a boy or a girl singing in a singing tone. Tole, lege, take and read. Immediately my expression changed, and I began to wonder whether the children used to sing this thing in a game, but I did not remember ever hearing it. Then I pushed back my tears and I stood up. I could not give myself any other explanation than that a divine voice commanded me to open the book. So I hurried back to the place where my friend was sitting here, and next to him were the letters of Paul. I reached for the book and opened it, and quietly read for myself the passage on which my eyes first fell. So Augustine has his moment of conversion by picking up a book and reading it. And the call to take and read, was commented on by Derrida and Jacques Caputo in a way that I found extraordinary. And it was actually through Caputo that I became interested in Augustine and some of his work. And so I want to read briefly from Caputo as well, where he talks about this phrase, because I think this will relate to the project and to us working with what we have at hand in a way that I think is quite relevant. Caputo says, Augustine heard the little child's voice say tole lege, which constituted a type of mystical decision procedure. The book that he seized upon was the New Testament, and in Latin translation at that. Not the Tanakh in Hebrew, not the Talmud, not the Quran, which had not been written yet, and not the words of ancient sages from the East, whose languages we could not read, and his books were not handy. Augustine, like everyone else, begins wherever he is, in the midst of the complex, conflicting, and multiple play of voices in which he finds himself, with the materials at hand that are made available to him by what we call the tradition, which he must sort through and appropriate. Had he been sitting in another garden at some other time, the results would have been different, because he would have picked up another book in another language, in another tradition, and been given other instructions. The tolle lege experience is a function of the materials within arm's reach. What Jacques Derrida is pointing to, in my view, is the phenomenon of what I have called above the first movement of deconstruction, the movement of historical association, of seizing upon the tradition and the heritage that we have been given, of taking and reading that which is at hand. Coming to this as a violin maker, this whole project, I think what's at hand for me? What's at hand for me is wood, compasses, varnish, materials, color. This is what I take, this is what's at hand, this is the tradition that I come from. I became a violin maker essentially to support my philosophy habit. It kind of took over. But I wonder, what is it that other people have at hand? What do other people in the room? I got to work with Jason's partner, who's an architect. Mm-hmm. Having that opportunity was extraordinary, to explore the philosophy of geometry with someone who is a practicing architect who has that whole foundation. What does it mean to take what we have at hand and bring it to a conversation? Working with people who are practicing psychoanalysts and social workers. I'm deeply interested in what it is that we can bring to a larger conversation and explode the traditional framework of master and student, of master and disciple. The tradition that I'm deeply embedded in as a violin maker is the French tradition of violin making. I did a hardcore 19th century style French apprenticeship. It was 5 years long. It took 9 years of exams and other things in order to be called maître. And at one point in my apprenticeship, I was forbidden to speak to non-French violin makers. This was on 57th Street in New York City. And it was absurd to some degree, the level of control and the refusal to open up the conversation to a larger project, which would have required a kind of open source approach. And not long after my apprenticeship, we started a group of violin makers from around the world who would come and bring our secrets to the table and be able to talk in whatever language was available about the things that we were learning, researching, and doing. And it was extraordinary what happened in order to basically facilitate the quality of contemporary instruments becoming much, much higher. It had a huge impact on the work that was being done and on the craft that was available. It was extraordinary to be a part of that conversation. And I still see that being at EGS and participating in a project like this allows for the possibility of exploring particularly color at this point in a way that hasn't been done in my experience. And again, as I said, the research project of looking into Stradivarius Varnish, it's been going on for a long time. People have been using scanning electron microscopes and whatever sort of chemical analysis that's possible. There's been huge advances in organic chemistry in the last 10 years, and a lot of conservators and museums have been looking at constituents of varnish in a new way. And I wanted to just show a few slides. This is the circle Stradivari, which we actually had here last summer and was used in a performance. And these are a few details. But I'd like to start thinking about this as a project of thinking. And thinking about the way these particular materials are used and what we now know about them. This is the top of the instrument in the back. This is a detail taken with a microscope. And I found this tied in really beautifully to last night's presentation, which I was very excited to be here for, talking about punctuation. I was thinking a lot about varnish and color as punctuation in a field where there was something else happening. Decoration as a punctuation in an empty field. And I started looking at a Stradivari in the Ashmolean Museum a few years ago and noticing these flecks of color, noticing that there was an opacity in a field of transparency, and thinking very closely about what this could possibly be and what it could possibly mean in visual terms and also in metaphysical terms for the people who were practicing at the time. I was starting to think along the lines of chemistry of the time, which was alchemy. Alchemy was the basis of chemical consideration and practice, and I thought what sort of material would be used by a painter or a violin maker at the time, and it's exactly the same material that was used to illuminate books. It's vermilion, and it's mercury sulfide. It was the most highly prized red of the period, and it's absolutely opaque. And you put it on a transparent background, and it has a kind of pointillist effect, where everything around it becomes more transparent. I started to find that in conservation circles, there have been more and more people thinking about the way that color was used in the period, and thinking about the effect that this had on the people of the time, and also allowing us to sort of decode their process in order to replicate it for restoration. One of the most challenging things I found working as a restorer, and when you're doing a retouching project on an instrument like this, is balancing opacity and transparency. I think this has deep philosophical interest as well, but the idea that something that's opaque can actually illuminate the transparent ground, I think is quite extraordinary. When looking at an Amati instrument and then another by Stradivari, the one addition that Stradivari makes that's so unique is he adds fire. He adds one of the basic Aristotelian elements. He adds one of the fundamental principles of alchemy in the form of red. Up until that time, you just saw gold. Everything was a search for gold. It was a search for water. It was a search for another type of experience. But with the addition of fire, with the addition of vermilion, you have a type of punctuation that's entirely unique and changes the course of aesthetics in a way that I think is significant. For this project, I want to consider what this means in terms of the use of materials and how this would be thought of and considered by the people who are preparing and mixing them. This is a close-up of the Varnish on Stradivari, and the one point in the middle is vermilion. And around it, some of these dots here are actually a red earth around here. And this was called rubricum, in fact. And that was one of the words that was used for it. It was a red field, actually. And so it was another opaque pigment that was put inside of this varnish. Here we have a cross-section, and I've spent 3 years studying this photograph, actually, with various scientists and other people, and also just geeking out on it because it's so beautiful. But you see here also the pointillist effect of little pieces of red in a field that actually makes it glow in a way that's entirely unique. So alchemy, I think, is worth considering. You know, where the word comes from, what it means for the people who are involved in the process, and for us sort of looking into that as a code and a way to understand process and how it relates to philosophy, and for me also how it relates to reading. One of the things in this project for me, and you know, as someone who works with my hands and thinking about reading, is how do we read things and what are the limitations of reading? You know, can we read affect? Can we read color? Can we read a line? We're talking and thinking about reading texts all the time, but I think that we read things, we read light on a daily basis in a way that we don't often talk about. And I think the definition of reading could be expanded. And part of the process here for me was thinking about taking and reading in a context where that expansion was possible. The reason that it's possible is because there's people from so many different fields with so many different opinions. And I wanted to see what it means to read in a different domain and to read in a different language. And that language could be one of light and color and line and not necessarily require any words at all. How alchemy relates to this, there's a long history of alchemical considerations of reading. Here's an image that I find magnificent. Again, on the top, you see cinnabar, vermilion, this red, that's actually used also as punctuation. There are a couple of lines here that are just punctuation marks that are provided just by the color in a simple line. And the book that's taken up is an alchemical text where you have a marriage of elements, you have a consideration of the sun and the moon, you have basic things, you have blue, red, gold, and black. And thinking about these colors in context and what they meant for people using them, I think is quite informative. We have a close-up of this image. And the idea here is reading the world and reading the cosmos and trying to understand how an individual, through their activity, situates themselves within the cosmos. The activities that were prescribed exploded scholasticism. They weren't limited to the classroom, they weren't limited to the library, they weren't limited to a lecture hall or to the monastery. They were very practical. The word chemia in Greek means to melt, to forge, to shape metal, to disperse a material. It also is an ancient word for Egypt. And in Egypt, the use of chemia was a reference to the black earth, which is surrounded by the red desert. So quite often you would have a black dot surrounded by the same color red to represent Egypt. With the addition of the Arabic al, you have al-chemia. And I think that this word is interesting with the idea of transformation and the way that transformation of materials is something that's also considered in a philosophical interior process of self-sculpture. How does this relate to us? How does this relate to philosophy? How do we ground this in a tradition we're perhaps more familiar with? And I think that there are ways of reading Hellenic and Roman philosophy. Pierre Hadot, who's one of my heroes, actually brought this to light, that many of these practices of reading and studying and philosophical exercises, he called them spiritual. He considered these to be spiritual exercises with the goal of self-sculpture and self-transformation. Philosophy was considered bios, a manière de vivre, a way of life. And Hadot emphasized this very much in his process of reading. He said if you read Plato and you're looking for a system, or you read Plotinus and you're looking only for a system, you're missing the point. The idea was to create a practice that would form rather than inform the student. It would also form rather than inform the teacher. And there was a reversal of roles when the questions were meant to be coming from the teacher and the disciple or student was the one meant to be responding to them. And the reversal of learning in these exercises I find extraordinary. And I think it's something that we can consider as an activity and something to further in our practice and study and consideration of philosophy. I felt again like bringing a different way of reading, a different material for reading, lent that possibility to us. And I wanted to explore that further in this project. In terms of alchemy, we're talking constantly about transformation of materials. This idea of melting, of forging, of changing one thing into another happens in varnish. The varnish pot that you see there, which we will apply to the cello, is actually sap from the trees that we harvested around here. About half of it is sap from large trees, and we melted that down last summer. It's been exposed to the sun probably for 20 years. There's a relationship with tree sap to tears that I think is very interesting to explore. The most expensive resins are always the ones that are in the form of tears. They're considered the purest, and we were harvesting tears from trees in the mountains, exposed to the sun for 20 to 30 years, and we were able, with Edie, we cooked outside on a barbecue in a hodgepodge pan. We were able to cook this resin and get a color in 3 to 4 hours that normally takes me 3 to 5 days, and because it's exposure to light. But this relationship to mourning and to tears, I think, is fascinating, and it goes back to the origin of the concept and the word varnish. Varnish comes from the word Berenice, and the constellation Berenice's hair has a mythology surrounding it that relates to varnish. The story goes that Berenice had a husband who went off to war, and she cut off her hair, which was golden, and she shaved her head and had long locks and hung it in the temple of Athena, and in the night it disappeared. She looked up to the sky and saw that her hair had been transformed into the constellation Berenice's hair. This constellation became an image for gold, for liquid gold, for light, and for varnish. And the city that became Berenice on the north coast of Africa is contemporary Benghazi in Libya. And it's where they harvested the biggest quantity of sandarak, which was used as one of the principal resins in varnish. Varnish is a fascinating thing, and the relation to grief and to mourning in that story, I think, is significant and ties in with Augustine's profound grief before he takes up and reads. Varnish gives one the capacity to turn a material, one of the Aristotelian elements, one of the fundamental elements of alchemy, the earth, which is represented by wood, and to transform that into water. When you put varnish on wood, it looks wet, and it stays that way. And that's remarkable, actually, for us visually. One of the other principles and elements in this varnish is amber. Amber is between 6 and 12 million years old, and it's harvested in the Baltic Sea, and it's extremely difficult to transform into something usable. Unlike the varnish that we cooked in an afternoon, it has to be cooked in a particular process, and it's very, very difficult to preserve, and you need to stay with it and watch it, actually. And usually you end up burning the clothes that you cook it in because they're so impregnated by the smell. And the transformation of amber, I think, relates in some ways to the alchemical process of the transformation of base metal into gold. There's this idea of forging and founding that again relates to reading in the self in a way that I think is incredibly ripe for this conversation. One of the elements that can be added to color is added to varnish is color. And I want to just think about a couple of different colors. And I also want to think about all of these things in a larger context. You know, when Berenice hangs up her hair in a temple and it's taken away, and then there's a whole culture of varnish that develops around it, we're working in the area of the decorative arts. You know, she does this and it creates a moment of peace. You know, there's a moment of non-violence that decorative arts can only happen in a time when there's no war. You know, there is an economy of violence that relates to the production of aesthetic objects. You know, in a way, to be able to produce a musical instrument, to be able to create an environment in which music can be practiced and studied requires an incredible privilege. And I think that's to be considered all along, actually, for me. To be able to come to this and have this conversation and to be able to do this work requires an absence of violence. And for me, the story of Berenice's hair ties into that again in an interesting way. She makes an offering to a war god for a moment of peace, and that allows for decorative art to prosper. There's also an economy in color, which I think is really worth exploring. The two colors on the table that we'll actually put into the instrument and that we've spent the last couple of days decorating and painting it with were the most highly prized substances in the period from, you know, the 2nd to the 15th century. The blue is lapis lazuli, and the red is vermilion, as I said. And both of these things were worth more than their weight in gold. You know, wars were fought over them. People were exploited for them. They were harvested quite often by slaves. Vermilion is mercury sulfide. It's highly toxic. And the lifespan of people who worked in the mines was usually around 2 years. And it eventually became possible to synthesize the material using just mercury and sulfur. The project was so toxic that it was illegal to do it in Venice, because if one of the containers that the work was being done in had a leak, usually everyone in the surrounding area would be killed by mercury poisoning. So it's a highly toxic material, and quite often the mines were in South America, Afghanistan, other places that people had to go very far for to acquire, and it passed mostly through the port of Venice. It's remarkably reminiscent of the drug trade, actually. Passages from a lot of cochineal and other red pigment that was highly prized came from South America, again harvested by slaves. It arrived in Venice and was very pure. It made its way into the rest of Europe and got watered down. There's a Titian painting where he paints the entire sky with lapis lazuli, and he obviously had an access to it that was unique. Albrecht Dürer, at the same time, bitterly complained about the price of it and was paying up to 500 times as much in northern Germany. So it was something, I mean, it reminds me of heroin in New York, you know. It arrives and it's incredibly pure and it gets watered down as it moves outward. And there's an economy of color and an economy in the drug trade that I think is something that should be explored a little bit further when we're thinking about the time and the way that these pigments were used. They're not economically neutral in any sense, in the same way that working in an environment on a decorative object that has no natural need to exist, I think is the product of privilege. And I think that privilege is to be considered when we approach material like this, and also to be criticized. You know, I mean, there's something there, the potential for a kind of decadence that I don't want to be blind to when we're doing this kind of work. And especially considering the toxicity of some of the materials and the long exploitive history of using them. The synthesization of color is a very interesting thing as well. I was looking at this color actually when Jason came down the other day, and his shoes are a magnificent representation of vermilion. And I find the industrial production of it has the capacity to democratize these colors and make them more readily available. And we also wonder, is there something lost in that process? You know, is there something lost in the process of providing greater access to something that was originally harder to find, harder to access, more difficult to work with, etc. And I wanted to show just a couple of other slides of alchemy. The place where the alchemical principle and process was most highly developed is in the Arabic world. And a lot of this work was being done in Spain up until the 14th century and made its way into Europe, which kind of allowed the Renaissance to get off the ground. And the exploration in color, particularly in its practical element, was highly refined because of the translations of Aristotle. And the work that was being done on Aristotle in this part of the world lended a practical element to the explorations that for me are interesting. There was an emphasis on medicine, there was an emphasis on alchemy as a practical art, and not just something entirely esoteric. Again, there's this idea of reading the world, reading the cosmos and one's place in it through an activity. And the activity was scholastic, it was also practical, and it had a chemical element. This is one of my favorite images. Actually, this is talking about color as medicine, and the use of color as a form of therapy. And it was regularly used as medicine. Various pigments were used in order to cure certain diseases. But sometimes the prescription wasn't to take them internally, it was to paint with them. And to use them in some way in decoration, to wash oneself with the color, to remove it entirely from oneself, but to wash one's hand with the color blue was a cure for specific maladies. And I find this completely compelling. I spent a lot of time in a pharmacy in Naples. There's a 15th century pharmacy that's been perfectly preserved. And looking through the materials that were in the pharmacy, you'd go to the pharmacy to buy drugs, to buy hallucinogens, to buy colors, to buy artist materials. It was the place, it was one-stop shopping for all kinds of things, for artists, explorers, people doing activities in a number of domains. And through spending time in this pharmacy and translating some of the things there, I found a few elements that were later confirmed to be found in some Cremonese varnishes. And one part of this project that for me is also significant is the relationship, as I started off with, of teaching and learning, of how research relates to teaching, how getting out in front of all of you, taking the risk of presenting this work, taking the risk of making a cello. The one thing that's amazing to me about this cello is that it exists and that there were up to 30 people working on it. Many, many people had their hand in it. We sat down and worked. At any point, the instrument could be destroyed. You know, the ribs are 1.2 millimeters thick, carving out the back to between 0.2 and 0.8 in millimeters in thickness. I mean, it's incredibly thin and delicate at points, and we pulled it off. You know, for me, it was in many ways an act of letting go, trusting people who came into the room, that they would pay attention. The fact that it exists for me is a testament to the possibility of transforming the relationship, actually, of discipleship, which I have a fundamental problem with. I've had a number of apprentices. There's a certain formal path you're meant to take them with, but I have a seriously hard time with it as well. And I'm quite interested in first impressions, first questions, first responses to things that may not seem to be coherent in a larger system of production and practice. I want to explore that further, in the practice of color, because I think there's something there that I'm missing. And I'm aware of many areas in which there are boundaries because I come from such a specific tradition. And I would like the boundaries of that tradition to be explored. In terms of color, some of Goethe's work on color I find particularly exciting because Goethe was not a great scientist. He was writing in the time of Newton, and Newton's work on color was kind of establishing the frontier of practical science and working with light. Goethe was very interested in the phenomenology of color, how we experience it, and he was very interested in borders. At what point does light turn from white to indigo? At what point do colors merge into one another? And the phenomenology and the experience of the individual when confronting color and working with it for Goethe was a deeply, deeply interesting practice. Exploring those borders and boundaries, I think, can take place in a variety of contexts, and I think it can be read in multiple ways. And so this is an active research project for me that I invite all of you to participate in as well. We are going to varnish the cello tonight. I actually don't want to do it, so I will invite all of you to join us in the workshop afterwards to put a coat of varnish on the instrument. It's a simple process, but it is remarkable, and I want to offer the brush to you in order to paint the instrument and watch wood turn into water, to watch earth turn into gold. And there is something extraordinary that happens when you have a brush in your hand. And I would invite you all to do it. It's a big surface. There's plenty for everyone to do. And it's relatively difficult to make a mistake. One of my daughters actually is an ace at varnishing and better with a brush than I am. So I'll let her be the quality control of the experience. But I would invite everyone to join us afterwards if you're willing to. The other thing is we've prepared pigments, and I have a lot of them. They're precious, they're wonderful to use and to work with. And I've also prepared a lot of pieces of cello ribs. I wanted to invite people as well to make something they can walk away with and use these materials. We used gold leaf, vermilion, indigo. There's a pigment that I made in the basement of the Louvre with a guy who is obsessed with varnish. He's one of the restorers that worked on the Mona Lisa. He was his responsibility was the varnish layers that were on it. And he said, well, if we're going to look at varnish, we've got to go and learn more about Stradivari. And he got totally obsessed with it and then started talking to a lot of violin makers. And he describes varnish in Cremona of the period, and on a Stradivari in particular, as one of the finest examples over top of some wood. And what I've brought here is wood that we can work with the idea that you can create a miniature or whatever, or play with the materials. One thing, I have a quote actually about one of the pigments, and it's from Cennini, who wrote Libro d'Arte, describing artist materials. And he actually says of lapis lazuli, which I love, he says it's illustrious, beautiful, and most perfect. Beyond all other colors, one could not say anything about it or do anything with it that its quality would not surpass. It's basically a varnish that you can use. It's a color that you can use and you can't fuck up. Because it's so pure, nothing you can do with it will make a mistake. I find that quite wonderful, actually. So I would like to make a formal invitation for all of you to join us afterwards and pick up a brush and participate in this process of alchemy, actually. One of the other elements in this process was a dialogue that I was having with students and with people that were in the seminar, and with Chris, of course, and also other people who were engaged in the process of crafting the cello. And the person who was here, the entire time and more involved in the process than any of the other students, and kind of through it with me through the whole process, and also now has contributed to the color project significantly, is Edie. And so I actually wanted to start the question and answer period with me asking a question. And I'm going to ask her about her experience of working with our hands, basically, and how that affects thinking. Edie wrote a piece that I found incredibly beautiful about the experience, but again, this wasn't about me coming here and making a cello. It was about me working together and continuing a dialogue. So I wanted to continue that dialogue with you in this environment, and basically throw out that we worked together. You know, you cut yourself while making the instrument. There was a lot going on, and now we're continuing the process through working with color. You're someone I saw in class always doing some knitting in the back and working with your hands. In this seminar that Chris gave on Heidegger, there was an exploration of the role of the hand. There was an exploration of thinking and, of course, of reading. And I wanted to ask you about your experience of thinking and handwork and how they relate.
I could very easily ask you the same question. Yeah, I think pretty much as soon as I heard about the Cello Project, I was just, it felt very instinctual to me to think and to feel that I would be very, very comfortable, that I would just kind of dive into an embodied way of experiencing philosophy, at EGS in particular. And so then, you know, I kind of like walked into the studio, and I think I was the first student to pick up a knife and the first student to cut myself with that knife. It became a very meditative thing. There was this kind of repetitive quality that it took on. And, you know, for those of us who are obsessional readers, we're maybe not necessarily paying close attention to what we're doing with our bodies all the time. And so it was kind of a way to pair with the reading a sort of relationship with one's body and with one's hands that kind of, I don't know, for me it was just kind of anxiety calming, right? Like I was always worried about showing up in class in a particular way, and then I would go to the cello studio and take the knife and just work silently, and just, you know, it was this way of somehow putting the thought into my body and then into the cello in a way that was deeply calming and ended up becoming this version of like making thinking. And in my own work, I'm problematizing and attempting to explore a type of listening thinking. And so it's these hyphenate practices that I'm interested in. So, yeah.
Did you want to read something from your piece?
Sure, yeah. So when I was writing the piece for the book, I was thinking about fantasy and how the reader kind of has fantasies that kind of unfurl. So I'll start with that one. If the reader suffers increased susceptibility to fantasy, do the processes of making a thing allow access to something like a textured thought? If anything, does the textural bring to thinking? Bypassing the pitfalls of nostalgia and romantic idealism are more difficult than one would think in a luthier's studio. So Robert and I had many conversations about, you know, we're working with this beautiful fine art object, and we're talking about Heidegger, and it's all very simple. It's an easy jump to kind of just get lost in like, oh yeah, we work with hand tools all day, you know, and kind of comparing that to our busy industrialized technology-driven lives. So yeah, I think it was just this question of like, what does working with textural materials bring to thinking, and how does it affect it? I never answered those questions, but I'd be happy to hear everybody's thoughts.
On that note, I would love to open it up. And if you have any questions, thoughts, comments, or challenges, I would love to hear. Yes?
So I was coming from a very rigorous training background. What was the most surprising, besides the fact that it was impossible to do this, what was the most surprising discovery from working in a much less, say, discipline, but a much less specific, rigorous training background when you were getting here? And was there something that was really, maybe one take home that was really the most astonishing discovery?
For me?
Yeah.
I mean, the thing that I came away from the project with was surprising for me. You know, the tool that I left with, or the tool that I started to work with. And for me, it came out of the dialogue that I had with people who were picking up tools perhaps for the first time. And it was the requirement for listening. And for me, I think I came away from it through the conversations I had and from the seminar with a new capacity, a developing capacity for listening. That has informed my work in a way that's significant. It's informed handwork, and it's informed my life in a way that I think is quite remarkable. So I came away from, that was the most surprising thing for me, actually, was the light that went on, that listening was far more important than giving instructions in this case. What does someone see? Where does someone have an area of concern in relation to a piece of wood and a tool? And obviously that can extend itself to other domains. And the way that it extends itself to other domains and the same requirement and developing capacity for listening being in urgency was astonishing in a really good way for me.
So kind of jumping off of that, so you and I have talked many times about your discomfort with the master-apprentice role thing. I wondered what makes it so difficult to wield responsibility of being the one who knows. Like, what's the tension there?
I mean, there's so many unanswered questions, and I constantly refer to my mentors still. And I look at people like Micah. We had an extraordinary young woman working here with us, and she was really, she was the anchor of the project, and she was the most skilled craftsperson in the room. And I look to her, and I will constantly ask her how to sharpen my own tools. She's better at it than I am, I think, and she's half my age, you know. And there's this who has the right to take that place, you know, and what are the responsibilities that come with it. At the same time, I like nothing more than going into a lecture and having a presentation made by someone who is a master of their subject, you know, who knows it inside and out. And I don't necessarily need to hear all of the extraneous voices in that environment. I think there's a definite place for it. It's just not one that I personally am comfortable with, because my limitations are constantly presenting themselves to me, certainly in craft and in other areas as well. Yes?
You know, Pirkle, like you explained, he talked about the spiritual exercise by reading the philosophical text, but he also made the same type of propositions that when one is creating art, it's like a spiritual exercise.
Yes.
And I think that then he is very precise about that somehow it's a type of analogy that in both cases, then one is state of mind and meditation of the self also, and the transformation not only through the practice, but that is something embedded in the practice that entails meditation.
Yeah. He writes about sculpture in a way that I find magnificent. He says that for the sculptor, you know, the sculptor is of course working on a piece of stone, he's also working on himself or herself, and if that's done effectively, that transmits to the viewer. And so for him, it's not just a private experience. And I think Hadot is really he has a great insight here. And he really struggled with the word spiritual as well. He called them spiritual exercises, but he wasn't entirely happy with the term. He felt it was too loaded with obviously the scholastic Christian tradition. And he was very hesitant, but he couldn't find another one that worked. You know, he used spiritual because its relation to Greek, and the Greek word for spirit, which is breath, and he could deal with that. But he felt the word spiritual was very loaded. And but in terms of his work on sculpture, I found it very important, his emphasis on the experience of the viewer, and in our case, on the experience of the listener. You know, if we make an instrument that functions well, it will be able to transmit the intention of the musician more effectively. And he talked about sculptures transmitting the vision, the experience, and the self-sculpture of the artist in a way that was unique. I don't know if that answers. Anyone else?
Well, just tell us about who's going to be the destinatary of this instrument.
So what?
Who's going to receive the instrument?
We don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Tell a little bit about what's.
I mean, there are
Future.
options. You know, we made this instrument as part of a project to make the EGS more widely known, to seek out partners, participants, students, to allies, you know, people who would get involved in various ways. And it has a certain value, you know. I would ideally like to see a sponsor take charge of the instrument in financial terms and have that used for scholarships or whatever else is needed at the time, and for the instrument to remain as the property, something that can be used for outreach activities and other things for the school. And but it's in many ways out of my hands at this point. You know. And it belongs to the school. It's something we made together, and it'll have strings on it tomorrow. So its final destination, I don't think we know, but I think it can serve a role, and it can create a conversation that can actually move beyond the mountains and move beyond Malta. We had an event in New York where we presented the cello, and it was sort of a first step towards a larger project of garnering support and using an instrument, a literal instrument, in order to raise awareness about what's happening up here in the mountains. Yes?
I have one question about the smell. I found it very capturing when you said that with the brush you move the wood from the earth to water, to liquid, but also the smell changes a bit, because the smell of wood is so connected with nature, whereas this smell, I was a wood restorer for 2 months doing high school breaks in Italy to have that. And whenever I go back to the guy who I was working for, the smell of the studio kind of already puts me back in the moment where I was taking out the varnish actually from old furniture. So I think it has a strong value as well.
I mean, on that front, my teacher...
talked about the olfactory elements of being in the studio.
No, it's strong, particularly now with varnish. I mean, there's lavender oil in the varnish. It's been used since the 11th century as a dispersing agent for paint. It helps it to flow much better.
How do you make this one flow?
In the varnish, it should be okay.
Okay.
And I added some lavender to it as well. The cooked pine resin, of course, has its own scent. My teacher would polish with benzoin, actually, which I'm going to burn some of it next door later. It's also used as incense, but benzoin is used as a polish, a final polish for the varnish, and it's traditionally an incense as well. My teacher would say that, you know, the instrument appeals to all the senses. You touch it, you know, you hold it, you hear it, you see it, but the one thing missing is smell. And so for him, putting benzoin in the polish and walking into the shop and having that olfactory element was really significant. And I was telling Chris, you know, Agnes, my first child, is in the back, and one of the first weeks of her life we actually spent on the roof in New York, sleeping outside with her as a newborn. We did a week-long cook of varnish that had to be attended to, and after we kind of came down from the roof, and I brought her somewhere, someone was like, "What have you been doing with this child? You know, she smells like trees." And that was in the Lower East Side of New York. It was one of the first weeks of her experience of smell, basically. But I stink of varnish all the time, and some of the aspects of smell are nice. Burning amber is not. You know, again, you have to burn your clothes after you, or get rid of them after you fuse amber. But I think it also smell is, you know, it's the sense that triggers more memory than any other of our senses, actually. So I think it's a really significant element.
Can I ask you a
Yeah,
question?
please.
I wanted to get your specific thoughts on the idea. This kind of came up in our seminar of working with the hands and its relation to craft. So I wanted to know what the nature of the relation is between philosophical thinking and making, specifically.
I would hand it over to Chris on this one. I think Heidegger responds to this in a way that is significant and that I feel totally unqualified to talk about. But in the seminar, the 2 seminars on craft, this was a theme that we explored quite a bit.
Well, okay, so perhaps what have been your associations or your thoughts about the process since last year coming to this year? It's been an entire year that we've been thinking about it, working with it, discussing what it was like to actually do this crazy thing that we did.
And I think there's a certain call for rigor in working with the hands. It's dangerous. You know, we work with tools that are actually, they are dangerous. And that's constantly present. And that's a kind of obvious demand for rigor. But there's a relation between the rigorous demand of handwork and I think the rigorous call for thinking. And there's a relationship there that for me is something important to explore. And I think that's where Hadot would come in and say that it's an exercise, that thinking has a certain requirement for rigor that needs to be cultivated in the same way that the practice of handwork needs to be cultivated. It's a skill that can and should be developed if the goal is to do things with more refinement, with more effectiveness, with more joy.
Robert, is the amber that you're talking about the same amber they use in fragrances as well?
It's actually not.
Not?
Yeah, so this is amber, which is fossilized tree resin.
Okay.
And there are two main sources for it. One is the Baltic Sea. It's harvested at the turning of the tides, usually after winter solstice. There's something that happens in the sea. There's a massive turning on the waning moon after winter solstice, and people will go into the sea and harvest amber at that point. So it's fossilized tree resin, between 8 and 12 million years old. There's another significant supply in the Dominican Republic, and that's 4 to 6 million years old and not quite as hard. There's two sources of amber in fragrance. One is a vegetable source, and the other is actually drawn from a gland in a whale. So those are the main sources of what we think of as amber. The one that's sold in North Africa is has a plant source. Any other questions? Comments?
Mr. Varnish.
Please.
Robert, could you simply announce the fact of the concert with Christoph?
Yes.
Say a word about Christoph.
Sure. So we had a cellist come here last year. He's like one of my heroes, and listening to a recording of him playing Haydn when I was in my early 20s is part of the reason I became a cello maker. His name is Christoph Kwan. He is a Baroque cellist. He's a god in my view, and he's a really beautiful human as well. He's done a lot of research into historical performance practice, playing music that's designed for groups of people this size, and not necessarily the largest of concert halls. There's an intimacy about him and his music which I think is unique, and he's a great scholar, a really, really great scholar, and just a very, very fine musician. He's also the only person I could think of who I could get to come up here who would follow me up and play on a glacier, which he did last summer. So our last day, we had a really beautiful day, actually, of going with him up onto a glacier and hearing the instrument in that environment.
The pictures on the back of the brochure.
We also did a process with him, which was, I believe, was done, in the early days of the instrument, where it was tuned before being varnished. So we actually went up on the hill here. And he found it wonderful playing outside because you're just held by the sound very, very close. And we listened to the instrument with him, and he guided the final tuning of the instrument. And Micah, who I spoke about, she was listening to him and listening to what he was describing and removing wood in particularly sensitive areas of the instrument. And we heard a difference immediately. It was totally magical for me to actually see that happen. And you get to a point where it's like hitting a bell and it rings and you stop. So Christoph is coming. He's going to play a concert here.
And just one word about the fact that we had a very memorable concert in Malta with Christoph and the quartet that he quatuor that he organized. I forget the name of the quatuor that his group there.
Emilio.
Yeah. He what was beautiful is he presented a Bach piece, which we will be returning to, I think, with Christoph for thought, analysis, and so forth. And one of the exciting things about this concert was that we wanted to talk, many of us wanted to analyze this together, think about it together. And we've been thinking about trying to adjust the notion of an EGS concert in such a way that there's a place for, very, very active engagement. And there was also, at that moment, there was a musician there who had a transformative experience with the violin, and I had the opportunity to listen to her talk about what was happening in those moments. And it's the experience of just extraordinary music and then engagement with the musicians and with Christophe and thinking about what had just happened and what this music was and how it related to the character of the instruments that were being played. It was really an extraordinary experience for me anyway. So it's all of these, at every step with our cello project there's exploration. What is it? What's the proper form for a concert? What is, how do we think about a seminar and these relations that you're talking about, participation, teaching discipleship, and the relation between teaching and research, which is profoundly challenged here.
I mean, for me, that brings up something as well as what's the nature of a concert, or what's the right place for one? What's the nature of the classroom? What's the nature of this relation? And in pedagogy, there's one of the most extraordinary meteor showers of the year is happening tonight. Pierre Hadot was saying philosophy happened under the stars. If you're with Democritus or Zenon or some of these people, we wouldn't be sitting in here. We'd be outside on our backs looking at a meteor shower, and then we begin to speak about metaphysics. So what the hell are we doing in this room now?
It's not too late.
It's not too late. And we will be sitting on the roof tonight watching it. And all are welcome to join. But for me, it's what's the nature of the classroom as well. What is the learning environment? When are we performing and why? And ask all of these questions.
Yeah, shall we varnish?